Unfortunately, most Christians are terrified of Hebrews 3:12, and you'll see why in a minute. But I want to explain to you there's no reason to be afraid as you read with me. Welcome to another Bible study walkthrough where we learn how to read and study the Bible. Verse 12 of Hebrews 3 says, "Take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil," and then he'll go on to say, "unbelieving heart." I want you to see this, because the first tip I have for you when you read the Bible is read things in context. That's part of the reason Christians are wrongly terrified of this passage, and it breeds all kinds of fear and despair and leads a lot of people to give up. I want you to not do that and understand this verse correctly. That requires us to correctly interpret this passage, which means read it in context. Tip number 1, read in context, okay? So, he says, "Lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God." This phrase right here is what terrifies people, okay? That there's the potential for me to fall away from the living God. And already within that question, and this is what I encourage you not to do when you read the Bible, already within that question are a lot of assumptions that you're the person being referenced, that Christians are falling away here, that falling away refers to indefinite, eternal separation from God and spiritual death. So see, there's a lot of assumptions we bring to the text. So my encouragement to you is don't assume, read, meditate, study. Let's go back to this verse, okay, and we're going to break it down. Let's read it in context. What that means is this verse right here, verse 12, it comes right after this quotation from Psalm 95, I believe, okay? I could be wrong, but I believe it's Psalm 95, where the author of Hebrews is quoting a passage that encourages people not to harden their hearts when they hear God's voice, okay? That is the main point. Do not harden your heart against the voice and the truth of God. There are people that did that. There's a reference to an event called the rebellion. It happened in the wilderness, where the Israelite people put God to the test after seeing his works for 40 years, and God was provoked with that generation. And this is what he says about those people. This is very important, okay? When you read the Bible and there's a comparison being drawn, and you go, I don't see the comparison, this word "as," he says, "Today if you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts as," which means he's comparing the hardening and to God's voice. He's comparing that to a specific event and person or people group, okay? So since a comparison is being drawn, what I want to do is go, what is being compared specifically about these two things, these events, these characteristics, these people, okay? The reason I say that is because by knowing who the author is referring to, it will help you make sense of who he's warning in verse 12. Does that make sense? Okay, so in verse 10, God specifically says, "I was provoked with that generation of Israelites in the wilderness, rebelling against the voice of God. They always go astray in their heart." Not sometimes, not mostly, always. That's an extreme word. That means for all of their existence, as long as they were on the earth, whoever they're referring to, when God said this, up to that point, they always went astray in their heart, which is rebellion. They have not known his ways. That's also an extreme statement. If they had known God's ways at any point, then this statement is not true. So this can be translated, they have never known my ways, okay? Now, we see they don't enter into God's rest. That's what he says. And I know this is a lot of context, but in order to make sense of verse 12, you have to understand what comes right before it. And in order to understand this verse as it relates to what comes before it, here's tip number 2, or whatever it is that we're on. When you read the Bible, try and zoom out as much as you can. You can get so locked in on one verse that you isolate it from everything else that surrounds it. And I'm trying to encourage you to not do that, okay? So when you read a verse like this that is especially terrifying and makes you want to cry and run away forever, which is what a lot of Christians want to do when they read this, zoom out a little bit, okay? So read the passage that comes right before this. Read the rest of the chapter. Read what surrounds this up to this point. What has the main point been? The main point is that Jesus is better. He's better than angels. He's better than Moses. And because of that, there's a great salvation we should not neglect. So whatever this verse has to say, it's going to fit into those main points. So when you interpret a verse, a passage, a section, understand the main points the author has made already up to that point that surround that passage. So I want to make sense of how verse 12, I know this is a lot of context, but we're learning how to read the Bible, okay? I want to connect this verse to every other main point that has been made. Take care, brothers. Okay, there's a warning here. Let me get my highlighter. There's a warning here. Because of that, I can decide what the warning is and assume to know what it is, or I can read before this. Has there been any warning up to this point? Anything he's warning the audience of or other people were warned of? Well, absolutely. In the immediately preceding passage, he talks about don't harden your hearts. That's a warning. That's a command, right? There were people who did, and it wasn't good. They didn't enter God's rest. So I wonder if that connects to the warning he's giving to these people who are called brothers, okay? Lest there be in any of you an evil, and I want to highlight the word evil here because that's just not a word you see all the time. When you see a word that stands out or it's unique and you're like, I don't see that all the time, highlight it, circle it. If it seems to have no connection to anything and it seems out of place, it's probably really important, okay? So this word evil is characterizing the kind of heart he doesn't want these people to have, right? Have I seen anything connected to having an evil heart so far? I'm going to ask you that. Well, yeah, I have. Once again, you just go up a little bit. He says, don't harden your hearts as the people of Israel did in the wilderness in the rebellion, meaning they had a rebellious, hardened heart. So since I've already seen the heart referenced when you study the Bible, think about if you've seen words already. I just want to connect it here and go, could this be the kind of evil heart he's referring to here in verse 12, right? Ask questions when you read the Bible. Super important. You'll be glad you did, all right? So it says, lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart. So what's another characteristic of this kind of heart? It's unbelieving, okay? So this is the kind of heart being referred to. It's very important to understand. When you see descriptions of an object or a person or an event, highlight that. It just will help you make sense of what the author has in mind or what the person has in mind who's speaking. He's referring to an evil, unbelieving heart. That's what it means to have an evil heart. It includes unbelieving and being unbelieving in this context. What does it mean to be unbelieving? Well, I wonder if I've seen anything related to that idea up to this point. Maybe read the beginning of chapter 3. Okay, this evil, unbelieving heart he doesn't want the people to have, which would lead them to fall away from the living God. Or, how it's actually read, lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart leading you to fall away from the living God. So, what I can do is try and make sense of this by continuing to read. And this is what you'll often do when you study the Bible. When you read a sentence or a statement or come across an idea that doesn't make sense to you, okay? You can meditate on it, you can think about it, you can pray, you can ask God to bring clarification and understanding, or you can keep reading to try and make sense of that and have your questions answered. Or, here's another possible thing you can do. Read, backtrack a little bit, which is what we're going to do. I know we keep doing this. But backtrack a little bit to see if there's anything relating to that statement that you've seen. So for instance, he says not to fall away from the living God. Up to this point, I have seen that idea already, okay? And it's here in chapter 2. He says, pay much close attention to what we've heard, lest we drift away from it. So there's a warning here in chapter 2 that seems eerily similar to the warning we see in chapter 3, right? There's a drifting away from a message they've heard, and the reason I correlate this passage is because in chapter 3, he says, don't harden your hearts when you hear God's voice, right? And then he'll go on to talk about this. We've already done episodes on it, but he says, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? In other words, there's two warnings here. Don't drift away from what you've heard, and don't neglect such a great salvation, okay? And that's close enough to chapter 3 for me to think, hey, are those possibly ways to understand, or are those connected, those ideas connected to what it means to fall away from the living God? And if I have a suspicion that certain verses I've read or ideas I've seen relate to what I'm reading here, I'll just note it down. All right, neglecting great salvation. I'm not going to write all that. Or drift away from what you've heard. Okay, I wonder if that's what it means to fall away from the living God. But it includes having a what? An evil, unbelieving heart. Okay? So something I would encourage you to do is think about, have I seen this word unbelieving or this word heart up to this point? When you see repeating words, those are key words to help you make sense of the passage. If a passage repeats an idea or a word, that's a signal that that is part of the main point, and that's going to help you understand the main point, okay? But, this word but, if you know already, we highlight the word but because it notes a transition, it notes a contrast. So instead of having an evil, unbelieving heart that leads someone to fall away from the living God, which, again, I should ask the question, what does it mean to fall away? So I'll put question marks, right? I can go to a Greek lexicon, I can look at other passages that use this phrase, or I can keep reading. Instead of doing that, he says, but exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. Have I seen the word hardened up to this point? The answer is, ladies and gentlemen, what do you think? The answer is, heck yeah, I have. Back in verse 8, he says, don't harden your hearts as they did in the rebellion. So what did the Israelites do as having evil, unbelieving hearts? Why didn't they enter into God's rest? Right here, it's because, if you can see it, they didn't enter into God's rest and they had evil, unbelieving hearts and were rebellious. It's because they hardened their hearts. And he's warning, not believers, but the audience here, rather, I'm not going to assume, but he's warning the audience to not have evil, unbelieving hearts that would be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. That's option number one. The reason I know this is because the word but comes into play. This word but notes a contrast or a difference or a transition of sorts. So instead of doing option number one and having an evil, unbelieving heart, option number two is exhort one another. And you and I don't typically in our English language talk about exhorting people unless you're in Christian culture. So what does the word exhort mean, right? Well, let's go to a Greek lexicon. Let's look at where else we see that word used in the context. And, we can look that up. Exhort one another, which is an encouragement that often comes in the form of correction too. Exhorting one another every day as long as it is called today. Okay? I'm just going to highlight the word today and day just because they seem to be standing out to me. The reason is they're pretty much almost the same word. It's a day, that's specifically now, right? But as long as it's called today, exhort one another every day. Do that instead of having an evil, unbelieving heart. So since these two ideas are put at odds with each other, since they're being contrasted and they're different, it's on me to go, why are they being compared? What is the similarity between exhorting one another every day and having an evil, unbelieving heart? If I was going to compare something, for instance, and I was going to contrast to, shapes and say, well, a circle is round, but a square has, 4 edges, right? What I'm doing is I'm contrasting one specific thing between the two, which is their shape, their form, right? So in this instance, since there's a contrast with the word but, I want to ask, well, what does exhorting one another every day have in common with having an unbelieving heart, right? It seems as though both of these are at odds with each other, and you can't have both. You can't exhort one another every day as long as it's called today while you have an evil, unbelieving heart. And if you have an evil, unbelieving heart, you won't exhort one another every day. Since this contrast, this word is letting us know these are two opposing options, that's what we can conclude. So look at what he says. As long as it is called today, then he gives a reason. Sometimes the Bible will use so that, or because, or for, but in this case, he tells us why we should exhort one another every day. So that, or that, none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. Okay? Sin is characterized as what? And I'm not using these colors for any particular reason. Sin is deceitful. In what way? Well, sin hardens. Oh, what does sin harden? The human heart up here. Okay? Because of that, I can start to make sense of who he's warning and what he's warning them not to do. So we can begin to piece this together. Is he warning Christians to not lose their salvation, reject, walk away from the salvation they have in Christ as born-again children of God? It doesn't seem to be that way. There's no reference to them being believers, even if you read into verse 14, which is what we'll get into in the next Bible study walkthrough. But verse 14 doesn't give us any reason to believe that these are Christians. He's writing to people who have heard a message, have an opportunity to rebel, and can still harden their hearts, and can have an evil, unbelieving heart in which they fall away from the living God, which, by the way, does not mean that they've arrived at a relationship with God. That we can't assume that. Falling away from something can mean you were close. It can mean you were almost there. It could mean you had something too. But falling away doesn't automatically mean that you have something, right? So these people, they're not exhorting one another every day because these are two different things. You can't have both. And they're hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. We're starting to paint a full picture of who this person is that the author is warning, okay? They don't seem to be someone who has yet come to know Christ. Even when you get to verse 14 and it says, we've come to share in Christ, and this word if, which we'll see in the next Bible study walkthrough, this doesn't indicate that this is a believer. So I want to put your minds and your hearts at ease, Christians, that this is not an encouragement to sin. This is not justification to live in the darkness because you're secure and safe. This is if you believe in Jesus through faith. This falling away, this having an unbelieving heart isn't something that I believe is biblically possible for a born-again believer. Now, you can throw other passages at me, but I'm just working with this one. There's no indication that they're born-again Christians that know the gospel and believe and trust in Jesus as Messiah and are repentant. So far, if we're to actually paint, and here's what I would encourage you to do. Go back to chapter 2 and chapter 1 and think about every other characteristic or description that has been used about the person the author is warning. And then you'll develop a picture that doesn't look anything like a believer. If you guys didn't already know this, we have a completely free 40-day Bible study program. It's free. It's self-paced. You can go as fast as you want, as slow as you want, as in-depth as you want. It's linked in the description below if you really want to learn how to read and study the Bible and go deep into that. You can look at our website at abovereproachministry.com and check that out. But you can also take the 27-day or 11-day program if the 40 days is not for you. Other than that, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough.